Next up and last presentation of the night is Hakim Cassimally, and Hakim will tell you which presentation is when.
Hello everyone. I'm midway through a 10-week course at Liverpool University's Continuing Education Department on writing sci-fi and fantasy. And this talk is the 5-minute version, so it's slightly compressed. So what is kind of science fiction and fantasy? I've actually written that I'm going to talk about speculative fiction. So not just, kind of space opera, but also steampunk and urban fantasy and various other genres. We've been looking at a lot of these genres as we do the course. The kind of person that attends, as you can imagine, there's a lot of 30-something white British males, but it's not just that. There's a lot more variety than you might fear of a sci-fi course. And there's a lot more to it than just physics and laser guns and spaceships. In order to write well, you have to think about what's the history of the worlds that you're going to write about, what's geography, how does power work, what are the economics of the systems that you're writing about. So, for example, if you're going to live in space, we need gravity, and one of the ways that you can create a habitat with gravity is to have these spinning cylinders. And there's all kinds of interesting scientific facts, like you have ground, and you've got another ground on the other side of the cylinder with sky in between. That's quite interesting scientifically. But also, who lives in these cylinders? Who wants to live on their own in a big tin can in space? Could it be a religious cult, or maybe a boarding school? Or, the possibilities are more interesting than just the physical situation. So we get homeworks every week. And for my first homework, 500 words, I wrote about an artist colony in space. So consider Duke Street and the road walks, urban regeneration. The same thing will also happen with spaceships. And why not? So we're to write 500 words. So I wrote these longhand, and of course calculated 150 words per page, and ended up writing about twice as much as I should have done. But that's fine, because actually cutting the words is quite interesting. You end up chopping out all the stuff that doesn't drive your story forwards. So all the philosophical discussions and all the bits where you're trying to be clever and write puns and describe stuff that nobody really cares about all goes, and you just end up having a tight story. This thing about constraints really makes your story stronger. We also get research homeworks. So for example, we had to look into terraforming and colonization. And fun fact, Venus, you couldn't live on ground level because it's too hot, too much pressure. You could live in the clouds, in a city suspended in the sky. Going on to the fantasy side of things, magic. There's all kinds of different ways of doing magic. Some of them come from Earth's history, Kabbalah, and so on. But the interesting thing with that is that you can't just do anything, because what if you can? Then you have magicians saying, "Oh, I'm going to do something," and they do it, and you've lost all of your narrative potential, all of the drama in the story. So you have to have an idea about what precisely can magic do, and it's got to be as rigorous as writing about science. For this homework we had 1,000 words, and of course I ended up writing about 3,000, and so that was even more fun to edit. Yeah. Oops. But there's lots of genres that we can look into. So urban fantasy is quite popular these days. Basically means present day plus fantasy. So a common theme in this is both comedy and angst. So consider Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example. But you also have similar things like Slipstream. So for example, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, or the Magic Realist stuff, or The Time Traveler's Wife, which is basically a housewife romance, but with a sci-fi premise. We also studied Apocalypse, which is really interesting. There's lots of stuff in there, lots of bullet points. One really interesting thing is that if we were to run out of oil tomorrow, 99% of the human population could be dead within a year. So let's hope that doesn't happen. And one of the interesting things here, of course, is that, again, it's really interdisciplinary. We're not just learning about, elves and swords. There's a whole lot of thinking that you have to do in order to do as well. There is a little bit of elves and swords. We had an Awayday in the park and learned how to hit each other with rubber swords. This was, of course, for writing purposes, not just because we're a bunch of geeks. Honest. Now, Manchester already has a speculative fiction writing group, and Liverpool don't. Are we going to let that happen? Follow me on Twitter or give me a shout afterwards if you're interested. I'm going to try and set something up maybe end of this year, beginning of next year. And as this is part of continuing education, you will have homework. So I want 250 words on possibly urban fantasy, possibly some other genre, set in Liverpool though, very importantly. And if you email that to me or ping me on Twitter, then I'll publish those on a blog. Thank you very much.